diabetes is a metabolic derangement of metabolism, basically. In other words, it's very difficult to metabolize carbohydrates and proteins and fats when you have diabetes. So in essence, or in short, you're trying to utilize insulin and taking that insulin to carry carbohydrates or proteins or fat as they're converted to glucose into the cell and produce oxygen and energy, but you're unable to do so. So the body tries to compensate by finding more ways to make more glucose from protein or fat because it can't utilize carbohydrates well. And so essentially, in the end, the cells are going to be starved because they're not getting the food, the nutrients from either carbohydrates or protein or fat. And so the cells become starved, as I mentioned, dehydrated, and then there's an electrolyte imbalance that occurs. And from that, an array or a cascade of events occur that lead to a lot of what we understand as high blood sugar that occurs. Well, diabetes is known. Some of the predominant types of diabetes is obviously type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes. Those are the most common types of diabetes. Type 1 is very simple. Type 1 diabetes just means you're not able to produce any insulin, and at the point that your beta cells from the pancreas stop producing, about 85% of the beta cell mass is gone, then you end up with metabolic derangement that leads to the sign of hyperglycemia. But this can happen in a very short period of time. And the body will try to find food, as I mentioned before, with diabetes. It'll try to find food in one form or another, regardless of the type of diabetes that it could be. And so it'll look to protein next because it can't utilize carbohydrates well. And so what you see, particularly in type 1, because it may be a rapid response of deterioration of the beta cell function, or it can also be a long-term response of the deterioration of the beta cell mass. But at whatever the cost may be, you end up being able to use protein, and the body will start using the protein that's in the visceral tissue or around the organs or in the muscle. And that's why you'll see that people will just lose an enormous amount of weight. And that's because they've used their protein stores that's in muscle and organ tissue in order to convert protein to glucose, which is sugar, so that you can get it into the cell to produce oxygen and energy, but it still doesn't. So type 1 diabetes, the unique part about type 1 is that it also utilizes fat. And it takes fat and converts fat into glucose eventually, but not with an array of problems. In essence, or in short, you end up with an acidotic effect when you convert fat to glucose or to food to use it as oxygen and energy. And remember, in type 1, you have no insulin being produced. In type 1, you either have to inhale it, pump it, or inject it. And so these individuals, it's almost like a cancer. They'll wither away because they have no insulin. Insulin's like a growth hormone. They call it anabolic hormone. Without this hormone, people will die. And type 2 diabetes, a lot more complex than that, believe it or not. There's still a little bit more about type 1 that we could discuss, but in short, you're not producing insulin. You have beta cell destruction either from some pathogen or some toxic exposure, and the body got confused. It's an autoimmune response, and you end up having no beta cell mass. Type 2 diabetes could be occurring for a number of years. Well, it's a very silent disease, and a lot of individuals have a predisposition to develop type 2 diabetes in effect because they have receptor defects and to use insulin. At the cell level, there's doors that we call receptors, and there's also receptors inside the cell to break down oxygen and energy. Well, the principal part or problem with type 2 diabetes is the inability to use insulin, even though they have insulin. So the body compensates by producing 5 to 8 times more insulin. Well, during this time, they may have not decompensated yet. They might have hyperlipidemia or hypertension, that is their lipids or their fat in their blood is high or the blood pressure is high, but their body hasn't decompensated yet. And it could take even 14 years or more. And so these individuals are gaining a lot of weight. The more insulin you produce, the more weight you gain, the hungrier you become, the more you eat, the more insulin you need to produce. And eventually your body is hypersecreting insulin to compensate for the fact that what it has doesn't work. So it decompensates eventually. But that's one of the defects. They call it insulin resistance or insulin insensitivity to your own insulin. And so you can imagine the medicine to most of type 2 diabetes is to move your muscle groups to make the insulin work more readily, to be able to utilize, to carry what normally happens with metabolism. 100% of carbohydrates converts to oxygen energy, 60% of protein and 10% of fat. So what we want is for the body to utilize carbohydrates, a little less protein, and not to really use a fat. Because when you convert fat for food, it turns into acids, and the body can't tolerate that. Gestational diabetes happens during the time that someone is pregnant, so it happens to females, obviously. And it just is sort of an alert of the body that there probably was already something there, and the pregnancy just caused it to come out faster. So anytime you have a predisposition to have diabetes or a familial tendency to have diabetes, and you put yourself under a stress response of any type, which pregnancy, albeit a good stressor, or it could be a good stressor, can push you onto a diagnosis if you have a genetic predisposition to not being able to utilize insulin well, like type 2 diabetes, or you're overweight and you have a family history of diabetes, as an example. And so these women already have these characteristics of this history in their background, which puts them at greater risk. Some of which probably had type 2 diabetes undiagnosed, and when they became pregnant, they established a derangement to utilize carbohydrates and proteins and fats. The problem with gestational diabetes is now you're dealing with a fetus. Now someone with gestational diabetes has a higher risk for having birth defects, and also having maternal morbidity and mortality to occur to her. And so it's really important because we're dealing now with two individuals or more, and we have to make sure that they're in what we call a euglycemic media. That means the blood sugar's in good control, blood pressure's good control, and lipids, just like we would in type 1 and type 2. But in particular, we have even tighter control with gestational diabetes. So there's different goals that we need to have. One thing that concerns us about diabetes in general is obviously what impacts the epidemic of diabetes has always been the decreased mobility, increased processed foods. We know that technology has added a lot to that. The globalization, Americanization has added to that. And certain groups of individuals, it just doesn't do very well. Obviously, the whole country is overweight, but we don't see the derangement or the burden or the severity of the outcome with diabetes as we do with Hispanics and other minority groups such as African Americans or those of Indian admixture or American Indian admixture. And we know there's close to perhaps maybe over 45 million Hispanics in this country, and you could say on average between 8 and 10% in general probably have diabetes. And then in certain pockets of the country, certain pockets of, for example, the state of Texas, like the borders of the state, there could be as high as 50% either have diabetes or a first-degree relative of diabetes, of someone who has diabetes. And so it's something that concerns us because there have been longitudinal studies done now in the border of the state for a number of years, as in other parts of the country. But in particular, in the border of the state in Starr County, what they found out that in doing genetics tests is that there's a variance on one of the genes. That is, there's something different in the genetic admixture when you look at a lot of individuals that have Mexican-American ancestry or other Hispanic type or Latin origin. And when you see that, it kind of, or it tends to explain the variance associated with severity, and it tends to explain the prevalence to some degree. And there's still a lot to understand about it, because the irony is that you can have the gene and have diabetes, not have the gene and have diabetes. Maybe in the last 5-6 years, they found the location of the problem. But what we do know is that knowing the location helps us as far as the basic science is concerned. But for those of us who work in the clinical aspect, we have to understand more what's happening at the cellular level as well, because then we can design either behavioral or pharmacologic or other basic science interventions. Because, as I mentioned, type 1 is in essence short and sweet as far as its understanding. You're not producing insulin. So we've tried to inhale, insulin, and the molecule's so large, it doesn't have too many promises as far as it work in the long term, because it affects the lung. Having this large molecule, you have to have good lung function. So you got a pump, and we've got very good pumps now that work, and we've got implantable pumps, and we've got individuals that can even have pancreas transplantation. But the pancreas is a very interesting organ that lies run to the stomach, and it's a small organ which only about a couple percent of that entire organ produces endocrine function, like to produce insulin, for example. But the pancreas also produces another hormone that acts opposite of insulin. It's called glucagon. This is sort of the culprit that we have in diabetes. If we could suppress glucagon, then we probably could have a handle on a lot of things. Because diabetes, in short, you could say it's a high...
You mean with pills or something?
Yeah. And so remember that the body is starving, or the cells are starving, because even though there's a lot of sugar out the cells, it can't be used. So the pancreas tells these cells to produce glucagon. And then the glucagon tells the liver to break down the sugars that's stored there. So you have more hyperglycemia. Whether it's type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, any type of stress response, it causes that. And then you end up using, if that doesn't work, then you end up taking, like I mentioned before, the protein and converting it to sugar or glucose, which is sugar, and then you end up having more hyperglycemia. And if you get into the fat, then it causes acidosis. And the problem we see is that whenever, diabetes is out of control, and oftentimes it's noted to be out of control by a number called capital A, little 1, or subscript 1, C, A1C. This A1C sort of reflects what the blood glucose is the past 3 months. A lot of people with diabetes need to know this number. So it's a percentile score. It's an average of all the blood sugars before you eat and after you eat for the past 3 months. The reason that number is used at A1C is because just a certain percentage of this glucose is supposed to bind around hemoglobin, and red blood cells turn over every 3 months. So that's why it's only a reflection of the past 3 months, because hemoglobin is carried within the red blood cell. So when we look at an A1C on a person, we're thinking we would like it as close as possible to 6%, 7%. If you don't have diabetes, oftentimes your A1C is between 4 and 6%. However, someone who's pregnant, we want it to be as close to 4 and 6%, hopefully 5%, because anything above 6, 6.5, getting close to 7, is an average blood glucose 150, 170. That's way too high, because we know there's already changes that occur on the tissues of the body with average blood glucose of 150. So A1C, therefore, should be around 6%, around 7%, no more, but it depends on the individual. There are a lot of programs here in Houston, not too many, of course, for Spanish-speaking patients, but there's the American Diabetes Association, the Texas Diabetes Council. These are organizations that you can Google, you can search, you can call to get information that you might need. With our program, we're in the Denver Harbor community. We're in the 2nd ward. We're in some aspects of the 3rd ward. And we do research and educational programs to not only manage diabetes, but to prevent diabetes. And we're out of the Research Institute, or the Center for Diabetes Research at the Methodist Hospital. And it's also part of Cornell University. So we look at the basic science of inflammation of diabetes. We're trying to prevent it in young women and their children. And we're also dealing with very, very complicated individual or complicated diabetes in individuals here in the community. But we have the tools to do it now. We know how to detect very small amount of protein in the urine before you have kidney failure. We can see changes in the eye a lot faster than we could and take care of them so people don't go blind anymore. So you can, you have to have a stress test if you're over 30, 35, especially if you've already had heart disease in your family. You've got to, check your feet daily. Check your eyes annually with a fundoscopic dilated examination. And you've got to continue to check your blood glucose various times a day, because an average blood glucose doesn't tell us very much. We need to know the patterns and the trends of your blood glucose, so that there's a lot of good insulins nowadays that are identical to human insulin. Not as before, we had a lot of problems with human insulin. I mean, with other insulins that were not human, I should say. They can call at 832-389-8457. That's 832-389-8457. And they could text information, or they could call me, and I could give them more information about how to contact me. Also, it's Villagomez at teamhs.org. But again, Evangelina Villagomez, and you could Google me and probably can find me easy that way too, and I can help them.